I'm Susan Yockey with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, a deadly blast rocks Damascus, Syria. Bombings shake Iraq during a political crisis. Obama unveils a strategy for a smaller, agile future U.S. military.
As we look beyond the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the end of long-term nation building with large military footprints, we'll be able to ensure our security with smaller conventional ground forces.
And analysts warn of a downside to sanctions on Iran oil exports. It's all ahead on the Voice of America. As we heard in the news, a suicide blast went off at a busy intersection in the Syrian capital today, killing 25 people and wounding at least 46 others. Syrian state media say an attacker blew himself up near a school and a police station in the central district of Medan in Damascus. A bus carrying policemen appeared to be the target of the attack. State television showed people carrying human remains and others shouting the blast was the work of terrorists. The footage also showed damaged vehicles, including what appears to be a police bus with shattered windows and blood in it. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack, which comes 2 weeks after twin blasts targeting security buildings in Damascus killed 44 people. Another wave of bombings against mostly Shiite targets in Iraq came Thursday as politicians tried to resolve a political crisis. Edward Uranian reports from our Middle East Bureau in Cairo.
The series of bombings struck multiple targets in Baghdad and in the mostly Shiite heartland south of the capital. It was a day of bloodshed reminiscent of some of the worst bombing waves in recent years. Dozens were killed and dozens were wounded. Iraqi security officials said 4 explosions hit the mostly Shiite slum of Sadr City and 2 explosions rocked the more well-to-do neighborhood of Kazimiya. Witnesses reported that many of the casualties were poor Shiite workers. The initial explosions took place during morning rush hour. Later in the day, a suicide car bomber blew up dozens of Shiite pilgrims in the town of Nasiriyah. The violence comes as thousands of Shiite pilgrims from Iraq and elsewhere are heading toward the city of Karbala for next week's observance of Arba'in, which marks the end of a 40-day mourning period for Imam Hussein, a revered Shiite figure. The bomb attacks came just hours before Shiite Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was due to meet Sunni Parliament Speaker Usama Najafi. The two men have been trying to find a solution to a political crisis which broke out when the Maliki government issued a warrant for Sunni Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi. Middle East analyst Fuad Ajami of the Hoover Institution in California says the latest violence shows the weakness of the tenuous power-sharing agreement between Iraq's majority Shiite community and its increasingly marginalized Sunni brethren.
It has to do with the death of the political process. It's a natural response when people despair of the political process, when there is no political process to speak of, when the whole premise of power sharing in Iraq, I would look beyond this little explosion and that one. Given the monopoly of power and the grab for power so clearly manifest in the behavior of Nouri al-Maliki, then it becomes very difficult to keep faith in orderly politics. It becomes very difficult to keep faith that this country can be meaningfully shared, because I think that it's obvious that Maliki believes that you can monopolize political power.
Ajami says Iraq is feeling the impact of sectarian strife in neighboring Syria. He says Mr. Maliki is taking sides with the mostly Alawite government in Syria as a popular Sunni-dominated rebellion intensifies.
When you look at what's happening in Syria, it triggers the sectarian paranoia. The sectarian paranoia of Maliki is intensified because he looks at Syria, a place he knew well, where he lived for 17 years in exile. And he can look and see that a Sunni-ruled Syria would hold much attraction to the Anbar, to western Sunni Iraq.
Neighbors of Iraq and Syria are taking notice. Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu held a second day of talks in Iran Thursday, telling journalists that there is an increasing danger of sectarian strife in Syria spreading to the rest of the region and igniting a regional Sunni-Shiite war. Edward Uranian for VOA News, Cairo.
President Barack Obama and U.S. defense officials have unveiled the results of a new strategy review to maintain U.S. military superiority with leaner and more efficient forces capable of responding to global challenges. VOA senior White House correspondent Dan Robinson has details.
The strategic review was ordered by President Obama last year to help guide Pentagon decision-making and setting of priorities in an atmosphere of budget austerity and sharp partisan debate over deficits and debt. In recognition of its significance, Mr. Obama appeared with Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta and the Military Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Martin Dempsey as the results were formally announced at the Pentagon. Mr. Obama pointed to the end of U.S. combat operations in Iraq, the drawing down of forces from Afghanistan, the killing of Osama bin Laden, and the successful NATO operation in Libya. He said these have brought the United States to a moment of transition.
As we look beyond the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the end of long-term nation building with large military footprints, we'll be able to ensure our security with smaller conventional ground forces. We'll continue to get rid of outdated Cold War-era systems so that we can invest in the capabilities that we need for the future, including intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, counterterrorism, countering weapons of mass destruction, and the ability to operate in environments where adversaries try to deny us access.
Mr. Obama said military forces will be agile, flexible, and ready for the full range of contingencies and threats. The U.S. presence in the Asia-Pacific region will be strengthened, and Mr. Obama said, as he did in Australia in November, that reductions will not come at the expense of this critical region. Secretary Panetta said the new strategy is aimed at cutting defense spending in a balanced way by about $487 billion over 10 years, but should not mean a choice between national security and fiscal responsibility. Panetta said a smaller, ready and well-equipped joint force would focus on the Pacific and the Middle East.
This region is growing in importance to the future of the United States in terms of our economy and our national security. This means, for instance, improving capabilities that maintain our military's technological edge and freedom of action. At the same time, the United States will place a premium in maintaining our military presence and capabilities in the broader Middle East.
Panetta said the U.S. military must be able to fight in several conflicts at the same time and confront and defeat more than one adversary at a time. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Dempsey was asked by a reporter what message the results of the defense review would send to Iran.
The message that we've had consistently for Iran is that we expect them to be a responsible member of the community of nations, not deny freedom of navigation, freedom of movement, freedom of access, and we are determined that they will not acquire a nuclear weapon.
In his remarks, President Obama said details would be emerging in coming weeks.
I'd encourage all of us to remember what President Eisenhower once said, that each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. After a decade of war, and as we rebuild the source of our strength at home and abroad, it's time to restore that balance.
Mr. Obama said the U.S. defense budget will grow more slowly over the next 10 years, but will meet U.S. global responsibilities. Asked about force reductions in specific areas such as Europe, Secretary Panetta said the United States will maintain commitments to Europe, and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dempsey said the country will always act on the foundation of traditional strategic partnerships such as NATO. Dan Robinson, VOA News, the White House.
We get analysis of the plan from Ralph Kosa, an analyst with the security think tank Pacific Forum in Hawaii. My colleague Victor Beatty asked him what he thought of the plan.
We won't know the exact figures on, what weapon systems are being cut or how many forces are being cut. It does look already they've signaled that the Army and the Marine Corps will probably take some hits. And the key point is that the whole strategy of conducting two major wars simultaneously, which has really been unrealistic for a number of years now, it has been taken off the shelf. And both global realities and fiscal realities have caused us to now have a strategy that makes a little bit more sense. And essentially, it still, allows you a one war campaign with a holding action in the other. People have talked about shifting to that for a number of years. So it's not real surprising to me. I think it's something that's long overdue, and it reflects the fiscal realities as well as the global realities. I think this administration has made it very clear, and I think the American people have made it very clear, that we don't want more Iraqs and Afghanistans. If attacked, we have the capability to go in and respond, but we're not looking for other major ground force operations as part of our national strategy.
What is the bottom line regarding imminent threats or potential long-term threats?
Imminent threat, we're certainly talking about Iran, we're talking about global terrorism, we're talking about concerns about non-state actors getting their hands on nuclear weapons. I don't see China as an imminent threat. I see China as a potential threat or a potential partner, depending on how we play it, and more importantly, how China plays it as it becomes more powerful. But certainly, the gap between the U.S. and China is still so significant that this is not going to tell the Chinese, "Oh, good, now's our chance to attack the United States." I mean, that's just silly thinking. There'll be some people that will probably claim that, but that's ridiculous.
General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, referred to Asia-Pacific, where America's economy will increasingly be reliant upon that particular region. What do you make of this renewed emphasis on the Asia-Pacific?
President Obama a couple of months ago gave that big speech in Australia about the U.S. pivot to Asia. And to me, the only thing new was the word pivot. If you go back and read the East Asia Strategy Initiative that President George H.W. Bush laid out in 1989, he talked about the need to shift toward the Pacific because the next century would be the Pacific century. Bill Clinton talked about the Pacific community and the need to shift our forces more toward Asia. So did George W. Bush. But obviously, we got a little bit sidetracked with various conflicts in the Middle East. But the idea that Asia was where our future was and that we needed to sort of shift and focus more on Asia is not a new idea. It started with the new vision, the new global order of George H.W. Bush, and we've been moving in that direction ever since.
Gosa says the nuclear review released 2 years ago stressed less reliance on nuclear weapons as part of the U.S. deterrent strategy because of superior U.S. conventional forces. He points to past commitments to maintaining 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, but he doesn't see delays in production of the next-generation F-35 warplane as a serious problem. Gosa says the key is the new plan's commitment to counterinsurgency and intelligence-gathering efforts.
If you're a news junkie and crave the latest news and analysis about the Middle East, follow us on our new and improved Twitter feed, VOA Middle East Wire. You'll find us on Twitter at VOA Middle East. Every day, we tweet VOA's own special reports, analysis, VIP interviews, and podcasts. Plus, you'll get the latest buzz from VOA's entire Middle East producers and correspondents. VOA Middle East on Twitter. Get a read on the news before it happens.
Iran's recent threat to close the Strait of Hormuz led to a defiant U.S. response. It raised concerns of a military clash in the Persian Gulf and also raised oil prices. But VOA's Al Pessin in London reports analysts do not expect the war of words to escalate into a military conflict.
Iran fired missiles and exercised its navy amid sharp rhetoric from officials who warned the United States not to move an aircraft carrier into the Persian Gulf, something it routinely does. U.S. officials made clear operations will continue in the Gulf, which is an international waterway. Iran expert Mark Fitzpatrick believes Iran's threats are hollow.
It's laughable that anyone would think that the U.S. Navy is going to listen to Iran's instructions and be shut out of an area of operation in international waters. It's just not going to happen. In that sense, Iran's threats have a kind of emptiness to them which should be readily apparent to anyone.
Iran also threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil flows, a move the United States would not tolerate. Still, Fitzpatrick says this week's rhetoric is not likely to lead to war.
I don't think that we are going to see a military conflict in the weeks or couple months to come.
But he says if Iran gets closer to producing a nuclear weapon, that could trigger military moves by the United States or Israel. Iranian officials say their nuclear program is only for peaceful purposes. But Iran seems to be feeling the sting of Western pressures. The U.S. and its European allies say the latest in 30 years of international sanctions are beginning to hurt Iran's economy because they focus on oil.
Now that sanctions are beginning to bite on Iran's sale of oil, it gets to the very heart of the Iranian economy. So they're feeling under some great pressure. And countries under pressure react in various ways, often by lashing out.
But Fitzpatrick says the Iranian rhetoric also has a practical impact, pushing up oil prices and providing Iran with a small infusion of cash. And analyst James Brazier of the IHS consulting firm says it would be foolish for the West to ignore Iran's threats.
Iran has invested heavily in its navy, and especially in unconventional tactics that could disrupt shipping through the strait. So as a result, I think one shouldn't dismiss the ability of the Iranian navy to disrupt shipping in the Gulf, but probably not for a very long time.
Experts say the Iran-U.S. tensions are likely to continue to rise and fall until either Iran builds a nuclear weapon or the West finds a way to convince Iran to halt its controversial nuclear program. Al Pessin, VOA News, London.
Analysts say a possible European Union embargo on Iranian oil may do little to get Tehran to cooperate on its nuclear program and could possibly contribute to a potentially dangerous standoff with the Middle Eastern nation. Lisa Bryant reports from Paris.
Diplomats suggest the European Union will likely agree on an embargo on Iranian oil exports within weeks, a move supported by members such as France.
Nous avons une réunion du Conseil des ministres des Affaires étrangères le 30 janvier aussi.
Speaking during a visit to Turkey late Wednesday, French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé said Paris hopes the oil sanctions will be signed off by EU foreign ministers by the end of January. He believes solutions will be found for EU countries like Greece and Italy that depend heavily on Iranian oil. The possible sanctions underscore a toughening approach by the West to get Iran to cooperate on its nuclear program. Western nations believe Iran is trying to build a nuclear bomb, while Tehran insists its activities are for peaceful purposes. But will an oil embargo work? Not as far as oil analyst Paul Stevens of the London-based Chatham House is concerned.
If you look at history, oil embargoes have never ever worked and never ever been effective. So it's not going to work, and it's just going to cause a great deal of disruption.
Stevens says EU countries that depend on Iranian oil can find new suppliers like the Gulf states, but Iran may also find new buyers for its oil in Asia. Iranian officials have downplayed the impact of Western measures, including new U.S. sanctions that could reduce Iran's ability to sell oil and other exports. But Tehran is also threatened to close the critically important Strait of Hormuz, the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Leo Drellis, director and chief economist at the London-based Center for Global Energy Studies, believes that closing the strait could affect about 16% of global crude oil shipments.
The fallout is obviously would hit the prices straight away in the futures markets. The prompt oil prices will rocket because of the fears of what might happen.
But Drellis believes the spike would be temporary as the countries adjust and the West taps into its reserves. For his part, Stevens of Chatham House doubts Iran will go through with its threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, in part because it relies on the waterway for its own oil exports. But he believes the deepening standoff between Tehran and Washington in particular is creating a dangerously unstable situation.
By trying to limit Iran's oil exports, it is essentially escalating the situation into what could very rapidly become a crisis.
More effective, Stephen and other analysts say, are tougher financial sanctions. Sanctions already in place have taken a toll on Iran. The EU is considering sanctions against Iran's central bank, but member nations are reportedly still divided on the measure. Lisa Bryant for VOA News, Paris.
There's a transition going on in Egypt right now, and reporter Rebecca Collard has been following it closely from Cairo. She joins us on the line. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Susan.
Say, do the Egyptian citizens feel that the current military rule is worse than that of Mubarak?
Well, people that I spoke to, it is a bit mixed, and people are a bit hesitant to start saying that this is worse than Mubarak. And, I mean, the situation is extremely different. Mubarak ruled the country for 3 decades. It was a very oppressive rule. And what we've seen from the staff from the Supreme Council of the armed forces has been only, about almost a year now. So while there seems to be some things that seem more, for example, this targeting of NGOs that we saw last week, but also the increase in military trials, which a lot of people have identified as extremely problematic. So the military has kind of moved a lot of the trials of activists and just people detained to the military courts, and that military court system, of course, a lot of rights groups say is not fair and not just. Now, to actually compare the two, some people are hesitant. They're worried by saying that SCAF now is worse than Mubarak. You're somehow lessening the legacy of what it was, a very brutal rule.
For decades, the relationship between the Mubarak regime and the Egyptian military seemed cooperative, but that's been changing. What can you tell us about that?
Well, a lot of analysts I spoke to pointed to what seemed to be a key issue, and that was that, Mubarak originally was a military man, and it has been a long time since we saw him in military uniform. So it's kind of easy to forget, and maybe there was even an attempt on his part to put forth this civilian image. But he took over from Anwar Sadat, who was part of the Free Officers movement that initiated the 1952 military coup, which took down King Farouk and first brought the military to power. Now, here we are, more than half a century later, and Mubarak was in power for 30 years. He seemed civilian ruler to most people, but at the same time, he seemed to be grooming his son, Gamal Mubarak, to be his successor. Now, a lot of the analysts I spoke to pointed out that for the military, this was uncomfortable, and not just because they want to see a military ruler, which might be true. They didn't want a civilian ruling the country, but also Gamal Mubarak was very much for economic liberalization, and that is a huge threat to the military. Now, the military is not just the armed forces. They own massive amounts of industry, and it's very unclear about what exactly they own, but estimates inside the country range anywhere from 20 to 40%. So economic things, industries, factories. Now, any form of privatization, of course, threatens that interest of the military. So now people are looking back at what was claimed as a revolution in February, and it's seeming more and more like a military coup. I mean, the military basically supported the protesters, and in the end, it seemed, and it's, again, really hard to tell, but it was more their decision to see Mubarak resign than it was just the people taking to the streets.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for talking with us today.
No problem. My pleasure.
That's reporter Rebecca Collard speaking with us from Cairo, Egypt. This show wraps up another week of VOA's Middle East Monitor. Our reporters, Cecily Hillary, Mohammed El-Shnawi, David Arnold, and David Bird. Our social media team, Yuri Hiltaichuk, Momo Hutton, and Jessica Stahl. Our director, Patrice Martin. Our managing editor, David Hutchins, senior editor, Bob Morris, and all of our technicians and engineers here and around the world that make the show possible. I'm Susan Yawkey. Thanks for tuning in to Middle East Monitor.
For more on the stories you've heard on our radio programs, visit our website at voanews.com. That's where you'll find in-depth reports, related stories, videos, and more from our team of correspondents. Or take the news with you by downloading podcasts of your favorite VOA program. That's at voanews.com. Online news for a changing world.